Hi and welcome to a new patchwork video from Serendipity. I'm Jenny and this is the second part of our foundation paper piecing tutorial. In the first part I showed you the basics of this technique, and now I want to show you how you can use freezer paper instead of regular printer paper. If you're from an English-speaking country, I probably won't have to tell you what freezer paper is. If not, chances are you've never heard of it. Freezer paper usually comes on a roll like this, and according to the box, it's being used to wrap up food airtight before freezing. For that, it has a special coating on one side that feels a bit waxy. And this feature is being used by patchworkers for different creative purposes. To use freezer paper for foundation paper piecing, you'll first have to get the template onto the paper, which can be tricky because it won't lay flat when you get it off a roll. I found a few suggestions online and tested them, and this is what I found. Suggestion 1 was to tape a sheet of freezer paper to a sheet of regular paper and use that as a support while feeding it through the printer. Unfortunately, my printer didn't like that. But trying to use it the way it is didn't work either. It got stuck and crumbled. A total failure. What did work quite decently, however, was to place the freezer paper onto my ironing board, coated side facing down. I carefully ironed it on medium heat and without steam, and it stuck to the ironing board cover but didn't leave any residue. But after leaving it to cool for a minute or so, I pulled it off and it was much flatter and I was able to print on it. But this is probably very different for every printer and you should definitely test it out first. Pay attention to feed your freezer paper through the printer so that the ink ends up on the regular paper side, not on the coated side. When you have properly printed the template onto your sheet of freezer paper, we can get started by cutting out the template right along the outer line for the seam allowance. Again, I'm folding the template along all lines between the different sections, but I'm not using the pattern tracer because I don't want to perforate the paper. The template needs to last a bit longer and I don't need to tear it apart later. Folding this paper is very easy anyway because it is much thinner and the lines are showing through on the other side. A quick side note, if you want to use freezer paper for foundation paper piecing, you really have to use your iron after every step. Having a small ironing mat and your iron on your table right next to your sewing machine will make things much easier and faster. All lines are now folded and let's start with section 1. Again, I'm checking to make sure my strip of fabric is large enough to cover the whole section 1 plus seam allowance. But instead of using a dot of fabric glue to attach the fabric to the paper, I will just iron it on. That's the special feature of this paper. It will stick lightly to the fabric. I gently remove a small section of the fabric from the paper so I can fold the template over along the line between sections 1 and 2. I align the 1/4 inch markings of my ruler with the folded edge of the paper and cut off the excess fabric. I repeat the process with the fabric for section 2. First make sure that it's large enough, and then align the top edge of the 2 fabric pieces right sides together. And now comes the major difference when using freezer paper. Instead of unfolding the template and sewing through the paper, I will sew as close to the folded edge as possible, but not through the paper. Here you can see it again up close. The seam is right next to the folded edge. I turn the paper over, gently fold open the fabric I have just sewn on, and smooth out the seam. Then I unfold the paper template as well and iron the paper of section 2 to the fabric. To protect my cutting mat from the heat of the paper, I always try to cool it down a bit before I move on to the next step. I now fold the template along the line between sections 2 and 3, cut off the excess fabric, and place the next piece of fabric behind the template, right sides together and with the top edge aligned. And back to the sewing machine. In this case, I'm actually using a regular stitch length, not the super small one like I did when I was sewing through the paper. That's a big advantage if you ever have to unpick a seam. I unfold the next fabric section, smooth out the seam with my fingernail, and iron the next section of the paper onto the fabric. Quickly cool down the paper a bit. To fold over section 4, I have to slightly peel the fabric off the paper before I can trim the excess fabric. I then position the fabric strip for section 4 behind the template, right sides together and top edges aligned. By the way, it's not that bad when you accidentally sew into the paper a bit. You can still peel it off later. If you're sewing too far in the opposite direction, meaning your seam allowance is too small, you can just add another seam right next to the previous one. I unfold the fabric, smooth out the seam, and iron on the next bit of paper. Small confession, I got too impatient to wait for the paper to cool down after each step, so I started sewing on several templates at once. While one was cooling down, I started sewing the next one. Here comes the final piece. I fold over section 5, trim the excess fabric, and place the fabric behind the template, right sides together and top edges aligned. And one last time, unfold the fabric, smooth out the seam, and iron on the next bit of paper onto the fabric. And now I trim everything that is larger than the paper template. If you're asking yourself how many times you can use such a freezer paper template, I tested it and was able to sew at least 8 blocks using the same template. After that, the paper loses some of its stickiness. The block is now done, and with the regular paper piecing method you would now start to tear the paper from the fabric, but since we haven't sewn the fabric to the paper, you can simply and carefully peel it off. Of course, that doesn't only save time but also a lot of paper. In conclusion, I would recommend using freezer paper if you have to sew many identical blocks where you can use the template over and over again. But you have to work carefully, especially when smoothing out the seams, because the fabric might come off when you move it too much. The grip of the paper isn't that great. That happened to me a few times, and yes, I managed to get the fabric back onto the paper without any major damage, but it was no fun. And you should always have more sheets of freezer paper on hand than what you think you might need for your project. For this quilt, I needed 14 sheets, and my printer ruined another 3 sheets. But if you like foundation paper piecing, you should definitely try out this variation. And if freezer paper isn't something that you can get at your local supermarket, you can find it in our online shop. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye!